Good morning, everyone. This is Tablets 101. The main source material for this class is Appleseeds and Fox Noses. So let me hold the book up for you guys to see. Highly, highly, highly recommend this book if you're starting to weave. It goes through, the first couple pages goes through how to warp, how to weave, and then you have the second half of the book is a whole bunch of lovely patterns. The one that we're going to be focused on trying to get to at the end of this class is your basic S-band. So this is a loom. So the basic parts of your loom is when you're weaving, the threads that go the long way, that's called a warp. So when someone talks about their warp threads or warping the loom, they're talking about your long threads. The threads that go back and forth, like this one, are called the weft. And the weft is what's used to lock your warp threads in place and hold your pattern. And then you use a shuttle to go back and forth, as my shuttle is tangled, to make the weft. And so the basic process of weaving is you open the shaft, which is the break in your warp threads, and that determines what's on top becomes your pattern. You do also get another pattern on the bottom, but we're going to go through why for almost all tablet weaving patterns you get a kind of a clean, crisp pattern. Let me see if I can get this a little bit closer. So I've got some clean, crisp lines here, whereas on the back I've kind of got a little bit more of a muddied pattern, and we'll go through why that happens. So with most weaving, to create this shaft, you're going to have something that separates the top threads from the bottom threads. And in a lot of more traditional looms or with inkle weaving, you would have threads on this loom.
Bless you.
Let me see. So you would have threads on this loom. Oh, did it freeze? Okay. Can you guys still hear me?
I can.
Yeah, for whatever reason,
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
There it goes. Okay. When I moved the camera, I touched a button and froze it. On a loom such as this, you could do inkle weaving, which there's a string that would come from here and a string to come from here, and that would pull this apart. But for tablet weaving, we use these tablets to turn and go through each thread at a time to make the pattern that appears on top. Any questions up to this point? And the basic process?
I'm very new to this, and I've never done card weaving before. Do you have to have an inkle loom to do it?
No. So historically, this type of weaving would have been done. You see how I've got a number of back and forths here, switchbacks?
Yes.
Historically, this would have been done all on one long run with the end tied maybe to a post or a tree, and then the end on this side attached to some sort of belt or girdle.
Ah, okay.
But for modern transportability, most people in the SCA are going to use an inkle loom.
Got it.
Any other questions? Okay, so the part of tablet weaving that is fairly unique is that because you're going to be constantly turning cards, and I'll do a couple passes just to demonstrate. And usually I weave face on, but we're going to do it this way so you guys can see. Is you see that each time I turn the cards, I get a different set of threads on top. And it's those set of threads that are going to generate your pattern. And so in this case, I've just got these lovely little diagonals going. So because we're turning cards, this does something unique to your warp threads. And I'm going to switch looms to get to a bigger thread so that you guys can see this.
Okay, well, Emily's on the bed.
I'm just going to separate these out so you see one set of cards and a warp. But you see as I'm twisting over time, I start to build up twist. In the warp threads. And this twist is what is pretty unique about tablet weaving. So instead of getting a nice square pattern with tablet weaving, you're going to always get these diagonals. And so these diagonals are either called an S or a Z, given that the shape of the letters. So S, the body of the S goes this way, whereas Z goes this way. So if I turn this card,
No, don't use it, please.
and now normally I'd be tossing the shuttle back and forth, but again, this is just a show. So again, with tablet weaving, I'm going to move the cards down so you can see them a little bit better. With tablet weaving, you're twisting these cards. And as you twist these cards, they build up twist. In your threads. And it's this twist. Let me get a couple picks in here. And I should be able to.
When you twist the cards between each shuttle, are you doing a full, like, the card goes 360 degrees around, or is it like a half turn?
It's actually a quarter turn. So we'll go through that. But here, you can actually see what I was trying to demonstrate. You can see now that you've got this angle in the red, with the red going in this. Let me see if I think I've got a pen to point this out a little bit better. With the angle going in this direction.
I see.
So that would be an S. Now, if I've been turning the cards forward, I turn them backwards, it will go in the opposite direction and go in a Z direction.
Super cool.
So that is, understanding that concept is going to make it possible for you to read patterns and set up patterns in your weaving. So typically card weaving has four holes. Let me try to get my finger out of there for you. So this is your typical card, and your card has historically maybe had 3 to 6, but vast majority of work that you see both in the SCA and historically are 4 cards. And so how we get those patterns is that we have, in this case, we've got 2 dark threads and 2 light threads. And it's that turning and that twist that then either gives you that S or that Z pick. So I'm going to pull up the Appleseed book and kind of show you how that would look in a pattern. So here, this is the S pattern that we're focusing on for today. And you can see that you're making this S by going back and forth by either having your cards point in this direction or your cards pointing in this direction. And then over time, to make the pattern, you're switching them back and forth from this way to this way. And it's the timing of turning those cards that makes your pattern. Any questions up to this point?
That book looks great. Those are fantastic diagrams.
Yeah, I patterned my own and I use the same notation. I find it really intuitive. So, moving this one down, which is just an educational purpose because the larger thread makes it a lot easier to see that, especially over the camera. We'll go back up. So when setting up your cards, we have what are known as two different types of cards. In this instance, you see that I have blue on the outside, and then another strip of white, and then I get into my pattern. But these cards on the outside are called a border pack, and they have the threads are all four the same. The pattern pack in the middle is the ones that are too dark and too light. So for tablet weaving, you will always have, at least with this technique, you'll always have two threads from each card on the top and two threads from each card on the bottom. So because of the nature of tablet weaving, where we have these S's and Z's that are on a diagonal, it's very easy in tablet weaving to do diagonal. Whereas doing something that's on a square grid is a little bit more challenging with this specific technique. So you'll see that for the most part, most of the patterns I work with are based on some sort of diagonal. So here I've got diagonals. The S's we just looked at are also based on diagonals. X's and O's, diagonal. So to set up all three of these bands here, although they're different patterns and different colors, are actually the same warp. So you have three border cards on each side and 6 pattern cards in the middle. And I'll show you how that works. Now you can see the cards. So for the cards, again, we've got a card with 4 darks for our border, another card of 4 darks for the border, a card with all lights, which I'll be difficult to see, but lack of threads means they're light. And then we get into our pattern pack where I've got 2 darks and 2 lights in each location. And I could go through and show you all of these, but they continue on. So to make the diagonals, we have to stagger the cards so that with each card that you have, you're going one subsequent forward in the pattern. So going back to this book, if we look one row across, you'll see that you have a white, 2 darks, 2 darks, and a white, and that continues on. So you have to stagger the light dark pattern when you warp to be able to do these diagonals. So in this case, a lot of modern cards are lettered to help with that process. Me personally, I go by the colors of threads because I also use wooden tablets, which don't have the numbers, the lettering. I know a lot of people who actually use playing cards and they'll just poke holes in them. They work really, really well. Or if you have cardstock, you can cut cards out and poke holes out of cardstock. And given the speed of which Amazon is doing deliveries, if you want to get started, that may be a better solution. So I'm hoping this shows up. It might be a little bit difficult over the phone, but I will do my best. Is that for my first pattern card, I have both of my blues on the top. My second pattern card has both of my blues in the back. My third pattern card will have both of the blue ones on the bottom. My fourth pattern card will have both of my blues again in the front. And then we've repeated it and we're back with both of the blue colors on the top. And so then each time you turn the cards, you're slowly cycling through these to get this nice diagonal pattern. Any questions? I know that's a lot of information, so I'll pause here and let people digest. And
so do you always turn the same direction? Like, are you always turning clockwise, or are you switching directions that you're turning?
Wonderful question. So if I want this pattern to always go this direction, I'm always going to be turning towards me. That's how these are set up. And typically when you're explaining weaving, because some people think away is different, so you say towards the weaver or away from the weaver is typically what is the easiest way to describe it. So, but if I want to change the direction of this, I'm going to, I can show you this, turn the cards backwards. And I'm not worried too much about cleaning up my edges at this point, just for expediency, but normally I'd be really focused on getting this tensioning correct to keep the length of my band consistent. But by turning and going backwards, I've now changed the direction of the angles. Can you guys see that here, where here we've got this turn and it starts to head this way?
On a band where you're always turning the same direction, what do you do about the tension in the twist on the far end of your yarn?
You don't turn all in one direction. So most patterns will work themselves out so that you have a section of the pattern where you're turning forwards or towards, and then a section of your pattern where you're turning away. And that'll balance the tension in the band. Historically, you remember how I told you that a lot of times weavers would have one long continuous band and they would just have it tied off. In those instances, you could undo the twist at the end and keep going with one pattern. But when you're tied all the way around in this continuous warp method, if you build up too much twist, you'll eventually not be able to move your cards, and then you'll end up with a lot of twist at the end and a lot of wasted thread.
Well, something I have found when I reverse direction in weaving, in order to clean up the selvage edges, I'll do an extra quarter turn on the outside cards. A couple of 2 or 3 of the cards on the outside gives a cleaner selvage edge.
Mm-hmm. So that's something that I do. What I also do is, for teaching this class, I've been moving the border cards, but you can change your border cards to be separate from your pattern cards. So you basically go in one direction with your border cards as much as you can until you physically can't turn anymore, and then you change them. So even though you might be changing your pattern pack to make this pattern show up, you keep the border cards going in the same direction as long as possible, and that'll help with tensioning and keeping your band consistent, especially if you've got a pattern where you're changing directions every 5 or 6 turns. It's very easy to start doing this. But by avoiding changing the direction of your outside cards, that helps to mitigate a lot of that. So the other thing that when you're doing an F band, that is a little trick is instead of turning the cards forward and backwards to go the different directions, the other way you can change the direction of the turn is by actually turning the card. So if you see here, all of my cards, the threads come, this may be a little bit difficult. Let me see if I can get the pen under here. But all the threads are coming in from this direction, from the top, when my card is angled this way, and then they go out. So it's easy for me to turn the card in this direction, but I can't really turn it in this direction because of the way that the cards have been warped. And we'll go through warping a little bit later. So instead of changing my S and Z pattern by twisting forward or twisting backward, I can actually flip the cards, and that does the same thing. So then I can have half of my pattern going as a Z and half of my pattern going as an S, while turning the cards all in the same direction and doing something like this, where I've got everything on the left going in this direction and everything on the right going in this direction. Now I can turn all of my pattern cards as one pack instead of having half of them forward to go this way and half of them backwards to go this way. So I'm going to take a minute to get that set up to show you how that works while you guys digest that. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask while I'm making sure everything's lined up okay over here. So now, and we'll just do this all together. Excuse me. So now as I'm weaving, even though I'm turning all the cards together, I've got 2 different directions going, and that's going to make little arrows. You should be able to see this in just a second. There we go. So now, even though I was turning my cards all in the same direction, I've got half of my cards going one way with forward and half of my cards going the other way with forward. So it's really up to the weaver, your preference on if you want to set up your pattern so that all of your cards are going the same direction, or if you want to have your cards split like this. I think it's very, very pattern specific. If I'm doing a wider band where I'm doing something like diagonals, something like this, I'll have all my cards pointing in the same direction, and then I'm turning them back and forth to get the different directions of the pattern. Whereas doing something like this, where it's a very mirrored pattern 3 and 3, this technique can make it easier to keep track of your weaving, because you're basically moving all of the cards together. Any questions? No questions? Okay. So what I'm going to show you then is I'm going to start weaving and just kind of let you follow along and see how I'm moving the cards to start making these X's and O's, because that becomes the basis of the S pattern. So we'll go through and do this pattern a couple of times, and you guys can follow along and watch. And again, feel free if you've got any questions about anything that I'm doing, just give it a shout. And I will do my best not to lock the camera as much as possible.
Are we going to learn how to actually load the cards onto the loom?
Yes. So this is a 90-minute class. We're about 30 minutes in. So my plan is for the next 30 minutes to walk through the pattern and how to make that S pattern. And then we'll spend the last 30 minutes of the class. That's why I've got my second loom ready, and I'll walk you through how to do the warp and load the cards.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And so here I've got another one of those arrows is about to start, but I want to make an X. So when I get to the point where it's almost done, I'm going to start turning my cards backwards, and that'll give me an X. And so if I want to do an O, now I've got the white showing up here in the middle of my pattern. And that's an indicator for me, and you can see a little bit better here. That's an indicator for me that now I want to start moving forward, and then I can close that circle. And so if you're starting to weave, practicing doing diagonals, X's and O's is a really, really good way to get the feel for not only the process of moving the cards, throwing the shuttle, and getting your tensioning correct in the band, but it's also a really good way as you start to see how the cards work. And because we're doing the technique that we are with the 2 darks and 2 lights, you'll essentially always end up with 2 lights at a time. So I've got a dark, light, 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 dark. So when you put all these techniques together, that's how you get the S. So let me show you this here. You can see that the bottom part of my S here is essentially the start of an O. And I've got kind of an X, and then I finish it up. So using the techniques that we just went through for the X's and O's, you can generate the S. So I'm going to start. I know I want the point at the bottom, so I'm just going to keep turning the cards back until I get that point, which now you can see it coming in the pattern. And so there it is. There's the bottom of my S right here. And so now I've got to the point where I want to keep half of my pattern pack going in the same direction, whereas I want to keep half of my pattern pack going in the opposite direction to start getting that S shape. So I will split my pattern pack, and because we've done the technique where we've got half the cards in one direction, half the cards in the other, it's really easy to find the center. Send those 3 cards back. But again, I'm keeping that border pack together to keep the tension on the edges. So now I'm not twisting all of my cards in one direction. I'm doing half of my cards forward and then half of my cards backwards. And I'll keep going until I start to see on the left side, might be a little bit difficult to see with the camera. I'll try to, I've got one blue one showing up on this side. And that's an indicator for me that I've reached the point of the pattern where I need to do another reverse to finish doing the top of the S. So I will send these cards back. Hang on, I'm trying to talk and weave at the same time, and now I just got myself confused. Yeah, there we go. So now my pattern's all back together. I'm moving everything forward. And I get the rest of the S. And again, I apologize a little bit for the messy weaving, but that's, yes, because I twisted wrong, I got a little bit of a float, but that's how you make an S. And I would continue this over and over and over. And going back to, you want to remove the twist in your pattern as you go, I'll change the direction of the S's each time. So you see this S is going in this direction, this one is going in this direction, and by changing that up, I'm keeping the twist the same as I'm going through the band. So if you guys don't have any questions on that, I can go through the warping demo part of the class, because that's where you guys are going to start.
When you're talking about thread, is there a specific thread size that works better?
I use Kotlin, which is a cotton linen blend. It's, I think it's 20 is what I use. The benefits of using Kotlin is that it doesn't felt, so that if I make a mistake, it's really easy for me to backtrack and undo my weaving and fix it and go forward. Whereas if you're using a thicker yarn like this, it's going to be easier to see the pattern. You're going to end up with a fatter, thicker band. But if you're using 100% wool, it's going to felt. And after you go a couple turns of the cards, it's pretty impossible to get the wool apart. So it's really kind of up to you what you want to use. And again, given the situation at this point, if you want to sit down and try working on this weekend, use pretty much whatever you have in your stash. I just wouldn't go too thin, because then it's going to be really, really difficult to work with and hard to see.
I didn't get a really.
I've had some luck doing pieces with multiple thicknesses of cord or thread in it, and it actually gives it a neat texture. The pieces that I was showing earlier actually have one thread that's, or one type of thread that's thicker than the others, and it pops out and gives a nice actual texture to it.
So
yeah, that was very effective. So I had.
Okay. So I'm going to show you on this larger loom. Each loom is going to be different in the path that you're going to take with switchbacks. For this, I'm just going to do one long forward and one long back, because I think you guys are a little bit more interested in seeing how you run through the cards. So you can either go from back to front or front to back. Really doesn't matter as long as you're consistent. My preference has always been back to front, so I'll put in the thread, yarn, or whatever I'm working with from the side without the letters, and then I'll pull it through the side with the letters. And I like to do it where my dark threads are in slots A and B, and my light is in C and D. But again, that's really your preference, whatever works for you, as long as you're consistent. So I'll do the run around my loom to get the appropriate length of the thread. Run it all the way around. I'll cut past it, so I've got a little bit extra, and I'll shift this loom back if I can. And I like to use the bar at the end to help me with the tie. So I get a little bit of resistance on the tie, and I'll do a double knot. If I'm using silk or a slippery fabric, I'll do a triple knot. But for this, a double knot should suffice. And then I'll do the same thing. I'll come from the back to the front, hold my thread here because I'm using that as my length. I will do the run of the entire loom. In this case, just the back to front. I check my length. I cut. And there are different techniques to warp. This is one where you're tying each individual thread. There's continuous warping that I don't do. I have cats, so having yarn everywhere just is asking for disaster. But I'm sure if you have any questions, Lord Floki, or I'm spacing on the mistress who is teaching the class this afternoon, probably has other recommendations as well. but for your first warp, doing a single tie is probably the best way to go.
The one doing the class this afternoon would be probably Lagertha from Kaid. She's also the one who I believe helped Demetrius and Floki. She's amazing.
And again, go through the card. I can't tell you how many times I've forgotten to go through a card and I've had to cut something off and do it all over again. Cut and tie. Go around the loom again. Okay. And so that's a single card. And I will repeat that the number of times that the pattern dictates. Again, the pattern we were just doing is total of 12 cards, 3 border cards on each end. And so to do a border card, I will follow the same exact process, but I will fill the entire card with the same color. So any questions on the warping process? Do any of you guys have a loom that you haven't warped before and want to walk through what switchbacks to use on for that particular loom?
Can I ask a question about cards?
Yes, go right ahead.
So you said earlier that on like the first card, it would be the top 2 holes, and then the second card, it would be like the front 2 holes, and then the bottom 2 holes, and then the back 2 holes, colored. So then you said just now that you're putting your colors in A and B every time. So after you put them, are you like turning it?
Yep.
So they're
front them. So some patterns, let me get Applebee's and Fox Noses back. Some patterns, they'll tell you here on the bottom, they've got A, B, C, and D, and they show you what colors to put in each so that you can keep all of your A's together, all of your B's together, all of your C's together. But as you're working the pattern, those are going to get mixed up anyway. So unless you're doing something that's all forwards and all backs together in a group like this, the letters are there as a tool. They're not in a guideline. I personally follow what my threads are telling me. So I can show you staggering that. Let me finish warping this one and I can show you how to stagger on these 4 cards. Because again, the thread here, the yarn's a little bit thicker, and I think it'll help demonstrate that a little bit better. So I will finish this. And again, if you're using cardstock or wooden cards, or you've made your own out of playing cards, you don't need to have the letters there to weave. It's a reference, it's a tool. Some people, when they're learning, they find it really useful. Me, I screwed up my first warp and the letters didn't mean anything, so I never really got into the habit of using them. And again, I would love to do this in person with everybody having their own loom and working on the same thing, but make do, we adjust. Okay. So now I've got 4 cards that have been warped. I'll scooch this all together. And right now, you should be able to see, yeah, you can see that pretty well. I've got all of my red threads are on top of both holes. And then all of my white threads are on the bottom. Yeah, guys, all see that? So to make the diagonal, what I'll do is I've started with the 2 reds on top. I've got 2 reds on top here, but I'll turn the card forward. So now my 2 reds are on the front. I've got 2 reds on top. I'll do a double turn here. My 2 reds are on bottom. And then with my last one, I'll just turn it backwards. You could turn it 3 times forwards, but it's faster to go backwards. And so now.
Thank you. That makes sense.
You're welcome. Again, this is why I was up late last night getting my last project off the loom, so I had 2 of them to show you guys. So now I'll go through. And the first few runs that you're doing with your shuttle, when you're getting the tensioning right, it's gonna look weird. Go with it. It's fine. You didn't do anything wrong. So you can start to see that angled pattern coming out. And it'll get clearer and crisper as I get my tensioning on the edges. And that's also why you do border packs, because it makes the pattern pop a little bit better as well. Whereas here I don't have any border cards. So it's just, it helps your eye to see the pattern by having those border cards. And so again, if I want to change to the direction of that angle, I'll just turn, I've been turning the cards towards the front of the loom. Now I'll turn them towards the back of the loom. And now I've got the diagonal going in the opposite direction. And again, when you've got the fluffier yarn, I'm having to spend a lot more time making sure I got a good shaft here, because the fluffy threads have a tendency to stick together. So you just, again, depending on what thread you're using, just be cognizant of that you want to make sure, so you can actually see it here. The threads are sticking, so you have to go all the way back to the card itself, put your hand in and push that down to clear that shaft with the fluffier material. And then with the larger, you can more clearly see that, the pattern with the larger thread. And so that's what I have. kind of give you a basic overview of the tools and techniques and an explanation of what makes tablet weaving unique.
How do you finish it off?
You cut it. So when the band is done, let me get one that I recently finished. You just cut the raw edge. And because it's woven tight enough, this shouldn't come unraveled. When you attach this to garb though, you fold the edge down to tack down that raw edge so it's folded. And then you just hand stitch it onto your garb. It's always painful for me to take scissors to something that I just spend an exorbitant amount of hours on. It's very counterintuitive, but essentially when you get your weaving all the way up to where your cards are and all of this back here is also woven, you just cut right at the front. And you'll have a little bit of waste, but you shouldn't have really more than 2 or 3 tablet widths of waste. But there is a point where you're not going to be able to get these back anymore because this is all in the back is going to be woven.
And someone had on the group chat, you mentioned making tablets from playing cards, but what about the shuttle?
So my shuttle, I have one that's a homemade shuttle. This I purchased online. I like this type of shuttle. There's a lot of different types of shuttles on the market for different types of weaving. For tablet weaving specifically, you want to try to find one that has a tapered edge here because that'll give you nice, crisp lines because you'll be able to beat really, really well. A lot of shuttles for different types of weaving, like rigid heddle looms, they're thick like this on both sides. I think if you're given the current situation, if you're stuck between a rock and a hard place for a shuttle, you probably could get away with cardboard for at least a little while, but it probably wouldn't last you very long. But if you've got everything else, cardboard cut into this shape, and then you've got the catches for the threads on the end. Thank you guys for tuning in.